library friends, it's Miss Abby here for another fun month of Read Aloud Roundup. I'm really excited to get started with the books that we're reading this month. It's from one of my favorite authors, Mac Barnett. He writes picture books for younger kids and older kids, and also chapter books. This month, we're going to be reading the first book of the Brixton Brothers series, The Case of Mistaken Identity. The first book in the Terrible 2 series, The Terrible 2, and the first book in Mac B. Kid Spy. Let's get started. All right, let's dive right in. The first book that we're going to be reading is The Case of Mistaken Identity. This is from the Brixton Brothers series, and it is one of my favorite book series. It is so funny, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you. One thing that I will point out is that it has really wonderful illustrations by Adam Rex, and I will show those to you when they pop up. Let's get started. The Case of Mistaken Identity. Chapter 1, America's Favorite Super Sleuths. Steve Brixton, aka Steve, was reading on his too small bed. He was having trouble getting comfortable, and for a few good reasons. His feet were hanging off the edge. Bed springs were poking his ribs. His sheets were full of cinnamon graham cracker crumbs. But the main reason Steve was uncomfortable was that he was lying on an old copy of the Guinness Book of World Records, which was 959 pages long, and which he had hidden under his mattress. If for some reason you were looking under Steve's mattress and found the Guinness Book of World Records, you'd probably think it was just an ordinary book. That was the point. Open it up, and you'd see that Steve had cut an identical rectangle out from the middle of every one of its pages. Then he had pasted the pages together. It had taken over 2 weeks to finish, and Steve had developed an allergic reaction to the paste, but it was worth it. When Steve was done, the book had a secret compartment. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was a top-secret book box. And inside that top-secret book box was Steve's top-secret notebook. And that top-secret notebook was where Steve recorded all sorts of notes and observations, including, on page 1, a list of the 59 greatest books of all time. First on the list was a shiny red book called The Bailey Brothers Detective Handbook, written by MacArthur Bart. The handbook was packed with the real crime-solving tips and tricks employed by Sean and Kevin Bailey, aka America's favorite teenage super sleuths, aka the Bailey Brothers, in their never-ending fight against goons and baddies and criminals and crime. The Bailey Brothers, of course, were the heroes of the best detective stories of all time, the Bailey Brothers Mysteries, and their handbook told you everything they knew. What to look for at a crime scene, shoe prints, tire marks, fingerprints, the ways to crack a safe, rip jobs, punch jobs, and old man jobs, and where to hide a top-secret notebook in a top-secret book box. Basically, the Bailey Brothers Detective Handbook told you how to do all the stuff that the Bailey Brothers were completely ace at. The Bailey Brothers, of course, were the sons of world-famous detective Harris Bailey. They helped their dad solve his toughest cases, and they had all sorts of dangerous adventures, and these adventures were the subject of the 58 shiny red volumes that made up the Bailey Brothers Mysteries, also written by MacArthur Bart. Numbers 2 through 59 on Steve Brixton's list of the 59 greatest books of all time were taken up by the Bailey Brothers Mysteries. Steve had already read all the Bailey Brothers books. Most of them he had read twice. A few he'd read 3 times. His favorite Bailey Brothers mystery was whichever one he was reading at the time. That meant that right now, as Steve lay on his lumpy bed, his favorite book was Bailey Brothers number 13, The Mystery of the Hidden Secret. Steve was finishing up chapter 17, which at the moment was his favorite chapter, and which ended like this. "Jumpin' jackals!" dark-haired Sean exclaimed, pointing to the brick wall of the dusty old parlor. "Look, Kevin, that bookcase looks newer than the rest." "General George Washington," his blonde older brother cried out. "I think you're right." Kevin rubbed his chin and thought. "Hold on just a minute, Sean. This mansion has been abandoned for years. Nobody lives here, So who would have built a new bookshelf? Sean and Kevin grinned at each other. The robbers, they shouted in unison. Say, I'll bet this bookshelf covers a secret passageway that leads to their hideout, Sean surmised. Which is where we'll find the suitcase full of stolen loot, Kevin cried. The two sleuths crossed over to the wall and stood in front of the suspicious bookcase. Sean thought quietly for a few seconds. I know. Let's try to push the bookcase over, Sean suggested. Hey, it can't be any harder than Coach Biltmore's tackling practice, joked athletic Kevin, who lettered in football and many other varsity sports. 1, 2, 3, heave, shouted Sean. The boys threw their weight into the bookshelf, lifting with their legs to avoid back injuries. There was a loud crash as the bookshelf detached from the wall and toppled over. The dust cleared and revealed a long, dark hallway. I knew it, whooped Sean. Let's go. Not so fast, kids, said a strange voice. You won't be recovering the loot that easy. Sean and Kevin whirled around to see a shifty-eyed man limping toward them, his scarred face visible in the moonlight through the window. The man was holding a knife! That was where the chapter ended, and when Carol Brixton, a.k.a. Steve's mom, called him downstairs to dinner. Chapter 2, An Exciting Case. The Bailey Brothers Detective Handbook tells you how to size up suspicious characters, which is useful if you're eating dinner with safecrackers or cat burglars or your mom's new boyfriend. Here's what the handbook says about identifying crooks. Hey, sleuths, Sean and Kevin are always on the lookout for lawbreakers. You should keep your eyes peeled too. There are scoundrels everywhere. Spotting baddies is easy. They all look, dress, and act in a certain way. Take it from the Bailey brothers. There are really only 3 types of criminals, and once you've got their distinguishing features memorized, you'll be an unstoppable crime-solving machine. Type 1, the tough. Greasy hair, scars on face, stubble, tattoos, loud necktie, cheap suit, poorly concealed knife or gun, limp. Type 2, the ringleader. Red hair, shifty eyes, uses gel or pomade, well-trimmed mustache, turtleneck, tall slender build, mysterious pinky ring, dressy trousers, limp. What do you think 3 is going to be? Type 3, the hermit. Long white hair, wrinkly, crazy gleam in the eye, missing teeth, large beard, uses an anchor as a weapon. Torn shorts, limp. Steve's mom had a new boyfriend, a.k.a. Rick. Even though he'd never met Rick, Steve already knew he didn't like him. Rick might just be a dangerous criminal. Steve secretly hoped so. When Steve came downstairs, Rick was standing in the kitchen with his hands clasped behind his back. His mom was there too, nervously stirring a pot of spaghetti. Steve strode into the room, looking hard at Rick, but trying hard to look like he wasn't looking. I'm Rick, said Rick. You must be Steven. Rick was 5 feet 10 inches tall. Steve, said Steve. Rick had a blonde mustache. I've heard a lot about you, Steve, Rick said. Rick had no knife scars or prison tattoos, at least no visible ones. Great, said Steve, who never knew what to say when people told them they'd heard a lot about him. It looked like Rick blow-dried his hair. Rick didn't have a limp. Rick was dressed in the tan uniform of an Ocean Park police officer. And so even Steve had to admit that Rick didn't fit the description of a hardened criminal. Too bad. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Dinner's ready, said Steve's mom, a little too cheerfully. Rick was off the hook. For now. There was always Bailey Brothers number 24, the crooked cop caper. Rick may not have looked like a criminal, but he sure acted like a goon. When he sucked noodles off his fork, he sounded like a vacuum cleaner in need of repair. Gross, I hate loud eating sounds. What do you like to do for fun, Steve? Rick asked after slurping a seemingly endless noodle into his mouth. I don't know, Steve answered. Stuff. Rick raised his eyebrows. Steve's a big reader, Carol Brixton offered helpfully. Great. Now Steve was going to have to talk to Rick about books. The worst. "Oh yeah?" said Rick. "What do you like reading?" "Bailey Brothers." "Hey," said Rick, "those books were big when I was a kid. They're about spies, right?" Detectives. It took all Steve's willpower to keep his eyes from rolling. Only a doofus thought the Bailey Brothers were spies. Right, detectives. The Bailey Brothers were those kids who were always riding around on motorbikes saying "gee whiz" and "golly" while breaking up smuggling rings. Rick was smiling in a way Steve didn't like. "Well, let me tell you from experience, Steve, real private detectives are nothing like those Bailey Brothers." Steve clenched his teeth. He felt his neck heating up. The Bailey Brothers were real private detectives. This guy didn't know what he was talking about. "Trust me," said Rick, tapping his badge. "I know what I'm talking about. In the real world, detectives don't use magnifying glasses. They don't race around in roadsters. There are no hidden passageways. Nope, private detectives spend most of their time alone in their cars, eating French fries and spying on jealous men's wives." Steve wished he could wallop Rick like with a haymaker punch right to the kisser, just like Sean Bailey would do. He looked at his mom for help. Unbelievable! His mom was smiling at Rick. She actually seemed interested in what this guy was saying. "Yep," said Rick. "Real detective work is done by the cops. Take the case I'm working on now, trying to catch this guy they call the Blackbird Robber." "The Blackbird Robber?" said Steve's mom. "That sounds interesting, doesn't it, Steve?" Steve had to admit that did sound interesting. Still, he wasn't going to say so. "Yep, the Blackbird Robber, a jewel thief. This guy's been terrorizing all the old rich ladies in Ocean Park. Just last week, he stole a ring from Mrs. Wertheimer, the woman who owns that mansion on the cliffs. This ring was worth $50,000. Rick whistled. "He took it while she was on a drive up the coast. Nobody can figure out how." Rick leaned over his elbows and lowered his voice. "The whole place was locked up. Mrs. Wertheimer had the best burglar's alarm money can buy. Motion sensors all over the house. Guard dogs so fierce you could catch rabies just from looking at them. I mean, this woman's got a serious jewel stash, and she's gone out of her way to make sure it stays safe, you know? But when the old lady got back home that night, the ring was missing from her bedroom. And get this, there were no broken windows, no open doors, no fingerprints anywhere." "My goodness," said Steve's mom. Steve didn't say anything, but he was listening. "Here's the weird thing," Rick said. "The thief didn't take anything else. This ring was sitting out on a dresser next to a bunch of necklaces, bracelets, fancy watches. But he only took the ring. Guess he's not too greedy." Rick chuckled. Steve rocked back and forth in his chair. He could think better when he was moving. "Why do you call him the Blackbird Robber?" Steve asked. "That's the best part. Every place the thief hits, he leaves behind a calling card. A single black feather. This guy's so confident, he's taunting us." "How exciting," said Steve's mom. "Very exciting," Rick grinned. "I've been pulling up files on jewel thieves from all over the state, and I'm working some promising leads. See, Steve, that's what real detective work is all about. Hard work and diligence." Rick emphasized his point by gracefully weaving a forkful of pasta through the air and slurping the noodles horribly. Through his mouth full of spaghetti, Rick said, "And don't worry, Rick Elliott always gets his man." Steve looked right at Rick. "I'm not sure your thief is a man." Rick stopped chewing. "A female robber, huh? Look, I've always believed women are equal." Rick looked meaningfully at Carol. "But most jewel thieves are men. That's just a fact. I mean, these guys steal jewelry. They don't wear it." Rick laughed at his own joke, and little pieces of spaghetti flew out of his mouth. "But sure, Steve, just for you, Rick Elliott always gets his man or woman." Steve kept his eyes on Rick. "I'm not sure the thief is even a human." Rick almost spit out a meatball. Chapter 3, Confrontation. The dining room was silent. Carol Brixton looked nervous. "Steve, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've solved the case. The Blackbird Robber is an actual blackbird." This time Rick did spit out a meatball. Steve continued. "The black feather isn't a calling card, it's a clue. Crows love shiny things. They collect anything that sparkles and take it back to their nests. And they're very smart. A crow probably saw the ring through Mrs. Wertheimer's window and broke in to steal it. Check out the house. I bet you'll find a hole in the roof or a tiny open window, something small enough for a bird to get through. That's why the thief just took the ring. It was the only thing light enough for a bird to carry. Steve smiled at his audience. Case closed, he said. Finished, Steve leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. Rick pulled at the end of his mustache, which was stained with tomato sauce. Steve may be onto something here. Really? Carol asked. Of course not! Rick let out a harsh guffaw. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Boy, you've got some imagination. A crow? Maybe he's teamed up with a monkey and a unicorn. I should call the zoo. Crow. Rick began making crow noises. Caw-caw, caw-caw. His squawking interrupted by snorts of laughter. Caw-caw. It was hideous. Stop it, Steve said. Don't you know anything about crows? Rick kept laughing. Carol shook her head. No need to be such a know-it-all, Steve. And don't lean back in your chair. Steve put all four legs of his chair on the ground and slumped. A bird-brained criminal mastermind, said Rick. That's real good, Steve. What do you want to be when you grow up? A guy who studies crows? One of those bird scientists? What do you call them? Ornithologist, Steve said. No, I don't want to be an ornithologist. Rick tried to compose himself. Well, what do you want to be? With an imagination like that, boy, you could go far. Steve dipped a piece of bread in some marinara. There was no way he was going to tell Rick the truth. I don't know yet, he said. Rick twirled another forkful of spaghetti. How old are you, Steve? 12. Well, said Rick, preparing to slurp, you've got plenty of time to decide. But Rick was wrong. Steve didn't have time. In 3 days, Steve Brixton would be the most famous private detective in the United States of America. And that is where we're going to stop. You guys, this book is so fun. Steve gets into some real hairy situations, and it's wonderful because it carries on in a series so you can read the rest of them when you're done with this one. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.